Hey everyone. This is part 3 of our series on configuring the ANJ-6248 PL. And this is the most important video in the whole series. Because the F1 menu isn't just another settings section. It's the heart of your entire energy system. This is where you answer the fundamental question: where does the inverter get its power from, in what order, and under what conditions? What you set here controls literally everything: how much you save on your electricity bill each month, how long your battery lasts, and how stable your power supply stays during outages. So watch carefully, don't skip ahead. If you haven't watched the first 2 videos, I'd recommend starting there. We covered menu navigation and the basic F0 parameters, including the CT sensor, which we'll be referring to again today. Alright, let's get into it. F1-01, Power Source Priority. This is the single most important setting in the entire inverter menu. There are 4 modes, and each one represents a fundamentally different operating strategy for your whole system. Let's go through each one in detail, with examples. Mode 1, SUB. Solar, Utility, Battery. Sub is the default mode. It stands for Solar, Utility, Battery. Picture this scenario. It's daytime, your solar panels are generating, say, 3 kilowatts. Your house is consuming 2 kilowatts. The remaining 1 kilowatt goes toward charging the battery. The grid isn't being used at all. The inverter simply ignores it as long as there's solar. Now a cloud blocks the sun. Generation drops to 0. What does the inverter do? It switches to the grid, which then powers the loads instead of solar. The battery isn't discharged, it just sits there in reserve. Now imagine the grid goes down. Power outage. Only then, and only then, does the battery kick in. It powers the house until either solar or grid comes back online. That's what SUB means. The battery is your emergency backup, not your primary source. The grid always sits between solar and battery as a buffer. When should you use this mode? If you have a relatively stable grid and you only need the battery as a backup during outages. If you want to get the most out of solar during the day while still having reliable grid power as a supplement. It's a great fit for vacation homes or offices where outages are rare. And here's an important detail about battery charging in this mode. If there's not much solar, say, an overcast day where the panels are only putting out 500 watts but the house needs 1500, the grid doesn't just power the loads, it also helps charge the battery. So in SUB mode, the battery will almost always stay charged as long as at least one source is available. Mode 2, SBU. Solar, Battery, Utility. The starting priority is the same, solar. But after that, everything changes, battery comes next, and only then utility. The battery sits ahead of the grid. And that changes everything. Here's how it works in practice. During the day when there's sun, it's the same as SUB, solar powers the loads, excess goes to charge the battery, grid isn't needed. But then evening comes. No more solar. What happens? Not the grid, the battery connects first. The inverter starts discharging the battery to power the house. And it keeps doing that until the charge drops to the minimum threshold. You set that threshold yourself in the F2 menu. For example, 20%, or a specific voltage like 48 volts. Only once the battery has discharged down to that threshold does the grid kick in. The grid then tops the battery back up to a certain level, and after that the inverter switches back to the battery again. The grid steps back into the background. What this means is, if the battery has enough charge to last the whole night, the grid won't connect at all. You'll run through the entire night on battery and wake up in the morning with some charge still remaining. As soon as the sun comes up, the battery starts charging again. When should you use SBU? If you have frequent or extended outages and you want to be as independent from the grid as possible. If you have a large enough battery, say, 200 or 300 amp-hours at 48 volts, to cover your nighttime consumption. If you're deliberately trying to use the grid as little as possible and minimize your electricity costs. This is probably the most popular mode for home systems, and for good reason. Unstable grid, frequent outages, the desire for independence, SBU ticks all those boxes at once. Mode 3, SUF. Solar, Utility, Feed-in. SUF stands for Solar, Utility, Feed-in. Feed-in means selling or exporting excess energy back to the grid. The logic here is, solar energy first covers all the house loads. Then it charges the battery. And if there's still surplus after that, it gets exported back to the grid. For example, the panels are generating 6 kilowatts, the house is using 2, the battery is already full. Those 4 kilowatts of surplus go to the grid. The maximum export power allowed is configured separately in parameter F1-05, which we'll get to shortly. And here's a very important warning I want to be absolutely clear about. SUF can only be used legally if you have an official feed-in tariff contract or a bidirectional meter. Exporting electricity to the grid without authorization isn't just a regulatory violation. It can cause a fault at the transformer substation serving your neighborhood. And the liability in that case would be yours. If you don't have a contract, don't enable SUF. There's a much better option for the situation. I want to use all my surplus, but not sell it, and that's coming up next. Mode 4, ZC. Zero Export to Grid. ZEC stands for Zero Export Control. And in my opinion, this is the smartest mode for a home system without a feed-in tariff contract. To understand ZEC, you first need to understand the problem it solves. Imagine you have 6 kilowatts of solar panels installed, but only some of your home's loads are connected directly to the inverter, say, 1 kilowatt worth. The rest of the house is connected to the regular grid through your meter. In SUB or SBU mode, the inverter only sees its own loads. It thinks, I have 1 kilowatt of consumption, I'm generating 6, and those 5 kilowatts of surplus have nowhere to go, or worse, they try to flow back into the grid. ZEC solves this problem decisively. A CT sensor installed on the main supply cable of the house, the same one we talked about in menu F0-12, continuously measures in real time how much the entire house is consuming. And how much is being drawn from the grid, or conversely, flowing back to it. The inverter receives this data every second and adjusts its output, so that the flow to the grid equals exactly 0. The house is consuming 3 kilowatts, the inverter outputs 3 kilowatts. Someone turns off an appliance, it drops to 2 kilowatts, the inverter reduces output to 2. Automatically, continuously, without any input from you. If solar and battery together can't cover consumption, the shortfall is pulled from the grid. But nothing ever goes back to the grid. 0. Literally. When should you use ZEC? If you have a large solar array and want to minimize grid consumption, but don't have a feed-in tariff contract. If you want to power your entire house from solar and battery, not just the loads directly connected to the inverter. If you want to be certain that not a single watt goes where it shouldn't. And a reminder about an important technical requirement. ZEC requires a CT sensor physically installed on the main supply input, and parameter F0-12 must be set to ENA. If the CT isn't installed or is disabled, ZEC simply won't work correctly. The inverter will have no way of knowing what the whole house is consuming. F1-02. Output mode. This setting defines how your inverter operates, standalone or as part of a group. Single. One inverter in a single-phase system. This is the right choice for the vast majority of home setups. If you have one inverter, leave it on single and don't worry about this setting. PAL. Parallel operation of multiple inverters to increase total output power. If you have two or more inverters connected in parallel, select PAL. L1, L2, L3, these designate a specific phase in a three-phase parallel system. For example, if you have three inverters on a three-phase grid, assign one to L1, the second to L2, the third to L3. Important: if you have a single inverter and accidentally switch to PAL without the proper wiring, the inverter will start throwing errors. Leave it on single. F1-03 and F1-04, output voltage and frequency. This is straightforward, I'll keep it brief. F1-03, output voltage. Options are 220, 230, or 240 volts. The standard in most countries is 230 volts. It defaults to 230. Don't touch it. F1-04, frequency. 50 or 60 Hz. For most of Europe it's 50. Defaults to 50. Leave that alone too. The only time you'd ever need to touch these is if you're taking the inverter to a country with a different standard. Otherwise they come set correctly right out of the box. F1-05, grid export power limit. This setting is only active in SUF mode. If you've selected a different mode, you can skip this one entirely, it has no effect. In SUF, this sets the maximum power the inverter is allowed to export back to the grid. The range is from 200 to 6,200 watts. A practical example. Your feed-in tariff contract specifies a maximum allowed export of 3 kilowatts. Set this to 3,000 watts. Even if the panels are generating far more, no more than 3 kilowatts will be exported. The inverter will regulate the output automatically. F1-06, F1-07, F1-08, F1-09, F1-10, night mode timer. 5 settings, but together they unlock a very practical feature. Let me explain with a concrete example, it'll make sense immediately. Here's the scenario. Your main mode in F1-01 is set to SBU, maximum grid independence during the day, battery running at full capacity. But you know that your utility offers a cheaper nighttime rate, say, from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. The timer lets you automatically switch operating modes for exactly that time window. For instance, set the night mode to SUB, and overnight the grid powers the loads while also charging the battery at the cheaper rate. At 7 a.m. the inverter automatically switches back to SBU and resumes maximizing solar and battery use. How do you configure this? F1-06, select which mode to activate during the scheduled window. If it's set to OFF, the feature is disabled entirely. F1-07 and F1-08, start hour and minutes. For example, 2300. F1-09 and F1-10, and hour and minutes. For example, 700. So in our example, F1-06, SUB, F1-07, 23, F1-08, 00, F1-09, 7, F1-10, 00. Done. From 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., SUB. Everything else, SBU. And here's one important caveat I want to flag separately. The timers run off the real-time clock built into the inverter. If the time hasn't been set, or it's drifted, the timer will fire at the wrong time, or not at all. So before using the timer, make sure you go into menu F3 and verify that the date and time are set correctly. There'll be a dedicated video on the F3 menu, but don't forget about this. Alright, that's the F1 menu covered. Let's wrap it up with one simple question you need to ask yourself: what's your situation? If your grid is stable, outages are rare, and you only need the battery as a backup, go with SUB. Solar first, grid second, battery in reserve. If outages are frequent, you want to minimize grid dependence, and you have a large enough battery, go with SBU. It's the most popular choice, and for good reason. If you have an official feed-in tariff contract and want to sell your surplus, go with SUF. And don't forget to set the export limit in F1-05 according to your contract. If you want to power your whole house from solar and battery without exporting to the grid, go with ZEC. But first make sure the CT sensor is physically installed and F0-12 is set to ENA. Next video, the F2 menu. It's the largest section in the entire inverter menu, 27 parameters, all about the battery. Charge voltages, currents, cutoff thresholds, balancing. We'll go through all of it in detail, with specific figures for different battery types. See you then.